Hello, welcome to the podcast for AP1. So, we are dealing with human anatomy and physiology. So, when we really start looking at the stuff, it's one of those things we kind of say, well, what does that mean, human anatomy and physiology? And really, when we look at the title of the course here, we're really kind of saying there's three words we obviously have to define, right? We have to define what does it mean to be human, what is it, what does the term anatomy mean, and what does the term physiology mean? And honestly, probably the first one is the hardest one to define here. So, what is a human? We have to get a little biological on this one because we are animals. So, it's going to kind of walk us through a little bit of what the classification of a human is. So, humans are animals, and we do have certain features that make us a particular type of animal. So, we are what we would call vertebrates. So, vertebrates, the main thing with vertebrates is they have a backbone. So, we have a spinal column. The next thing is it's the humans, we are a mammal. So, mammals are, by definition, animals that have mammary glands first and foremost. So milk-producing glands that help to care for their young. Outside of that, we have hair. We are endothermic, meaning that we are warm-blooded. We have different teeth, and we also have the three different middle ear bones, which you might not see in other animals. We even take it a little bit further than that. We are, at least in terms of mammals, we are of a particular type. We are a primate. So primates, what do they have? First thing, we have these. So we have the thumbs. So and they're opposable, meaning we can do a lot of stuff with our hands because we do have these thumbs. We can pick things up, move things around. If you kind of look at your dog, they really don't have that same ability, do they? Because they don't have any thumbs. We have collarbones, we have mammary glands, and at least with humans, we only have two because we are a primate. Why only two? What's kind of interesting on this one is really the number of mammary glands you have is usually about double what your normal litter size would be. So humans, we normally give birth to how many kids at once? And the answer to that is usually going to be one. So we actually usually have two mammary glands. If you look at other animals, for instance, a mouse, they have a tendency to have about 4 to 5 in a litter, and they have 10 mammary glands. So kind of an interesting aside on that one. We do have forward-facing eyes, so we have good depth perception. And taking it even one step further, we are hominids, and one of the few hominids, actually. So this means we walk on 2 legs. And the other thing is hominids, because it freed up our hands and other things like that, I think that's part of the reason that we are decently well-hung brain-wise. So we have a very large body size, very large brain to body size. So we do not have the largest brains in the animal kingdom, but for our body size, we have the largest brains. So, things like a blue whale definitely have a larger brain. That being said, they're much larger than us as well. And body to brain, pretty much brain size to body size, that ratio, we are going to have the largest ratio there. That being said, the whole thing about becoming bipedal and having large body to brain, large brain to body size, one of the things that really makes difficult for humans, and any of the ladies could probably attest to this that have had any kids, is it makes childbirth quite difficult. Because one of the things that happens when you become bipedal is you end up getting a narrower pelvis, which is going to make childbirth more difficult anyways. And then to add on top of that, we decided that we were going to have extremely large heads. Those two things together don't work well, and that's why humans, really when they come out, if you think like a horse, it's up and walking within 15, 20 minutes. Humans, they're up and walking within maybe 9 months to 13, 14 months. A little bit longer to kind of get going there. So it's mainly because we have to come out relatively underdeveloped due to the large brain size. Like I said, that was really honestly the harder definition. And then when we start looking at what is anatomy, anatomy very simply, it actually comes from, I think it's in Latin, ana and tomos. So ana means up or apart, and tomos means to cut up, to cut. So we put those together to cut up or apart, and it really goes into, that's how we figured out how we were put together. There was people that did dissections. Da Vinci was one of the people that did this. A lot of other people, that's how we really learned everything else. They looked at people after they died and really cut them up to see how they were put together. It's kind of like anything that you want to figure out how it works. One of the things you usually have to do, you have to take it apart. And there is a lot of different types of anatomy. We have what we call gross anatomy, which is gross as in large, not gross as in, ooh, that's disgusting. Granted, some of the time that might be one and the same. Outside of that, we're looking at the different other types of anatomy, and this is some of the stuff that we will get onto later in the course. You have things like histology or cytology, where you're looking at the study of something a little bit smaller, where you're using a microscope. So histology is the study of tissues. We'll look at that when we look at the tissues. Cytology is the study of cells. We'll look at that when we look into what goes on within the cells. Physiology, to me, is the more fun of the two here between anatomy and physiology, because it's not just how is it put together, what do we call it, it's how does it work. And to me, that's, at least to myself, that is way more interesting. It's really how things work. And a lot of interesting stuff goes into this. So how do muscles contract? How are we able to run? How does our heart beat? How is our heart regulated? That's all getting into that physiology. How is everything actually working to keep the body functioning? And really, can you really pull these two things apart? I know some courses try to do this at certain colleges. They will try to do an anatomy course and a physiology course. To me, the best way to learn these things is together. So learn about the anatomy and then tie in that physiology, because they're integrated. You can't pull one from the other, honestly. The reason why something functions a particular way is because of how it's built. And to me, it's really hard to kind of pull these two things apart. The function, structure and function going together is a big key concept that we will come back to over and over again in anatomy and physiology. It's one of those things you don't get away from. The structure of something is greatly related to what it's going to do. I mean, in the examples at the end of the bottom of this slide here, can you eat soup with a fork? Well, you can, but it doesn't work well. Why, though? And it really goes into, it's not the right structure for eating soup. So it really, again, goes down to that structure and functioning. And to me, that is one of our key concepts of anatomy and physiology throughout. What I would say is probably the biggest concept, though, and if we're going to talk about having a fundamental concept of a class, so the most fundamental and powerful concept of anatomy and physiology is going to be something that we refer to as homeostasis. Homeostasis, what it really is meaning is its internal balance, even though the external environment may be changing. So to give you an example, why we're at 98.6 body temp, give or take a little bit, is because we are maintaining homeostasis. Even though it might be 90 outside or it might be 10 degrees outside, we can get our body to stay within a relatively tight range. And all the other things are linked back to this. So if you're ever trying to figure out why something is important, start trying to bring it back to this idea of homeostasis. How does it help maintain homeostasis? Everything else in this course, if you look at it through kind of the prism of homeostasis, you should be able to get some information of why this is important. And I always kind of tell my students, this, along with some of the other key questions that I'll give you, are really like the picture on a puzzle box. It's really there to show you how all the pieces go together and what you're really looking for at the end. It's way more difficult to put together a puzzle without the picture on the box, because from looking at any one little piece, it's hard to see where it fits. When you have an overall idea of what the big idea is, it's a lot easier to see where the little pieces can fit into that. So, and homeostasis is that concept. So we're going to talk a little bit about defining it and how we maintain it a little bit, and that will be it for this first little PowerPoint podcast here. So the body, I've seen a lot of different numbers, anywhere from 10 to 100 trillion cells. Anyway, it comes down to it, we have a ridiculous number of cells in the body. Way more cells than you can even imagine. And what's even crazier than that is we are a big ecosystem for all your normal bacteria and other things like that, and they actually outnumber our own body cells 10 to 1. So on top of all our cells interacting with one another, you also have cells of other organisms interacting with our body as well. So, I mean, we're talking hundreds of trillions of cells all interacting with one another. But at least if we just look at our body cells, let's say there's 10 trillion. All these things need to have the correct amounts of oxygen, nutrients. They have to be able to get rid of the waste. They have to be at the right temperature, pH, have the right number of ions, electrolytes, all this other stuff like that. And that's just to keep them functioning normally. So really, all these things have to be in a particular level of homeostasis in order for you to not stop functioning immediately. And when we start talking about having, let's say, just 10 trillion cells, most people can't really think about what a trillion is, so I always try to go to a billion. How big is a billion? And even for most people, that's kind of hard to think about, because a lot of times I'll ask, how long is a billion seconds? So if I was going to say count to a billion, one at 1 second, say 2 at 2 seconds, all the way on, how long do you think it would take you to count to a billion? And if you have young kids, this is something you might be able to do with them just to kind of mess with them, because you keep them busy for quite a while. Because a billion seconds is about somewhere between 32 and 33 years. So, I mean, that's giving you an idea of a billion, and there is a 999,000 billion and a trillion. So, I mean, we're talking just numbers that are really difficult to grasp at all. So let's kind of take a look at least in homeostasis, what I always like to do a lot of times is try to use an analogy to put stuff together and then bring it back to more of a relevant or human body type of thing here. So an easy one for everyone to kind of deal with is to deal with like a thermostat. So if you have central air and a furnace in your house, this is be one that's pretty straightforward to see. You set your, and let's say you have a nice thermostat that can do a range. We have a particular range we want to keep our house in. Let's say that range is 68 to 72. If the temperature is within that range, what happens? Does your furnace kick on? No. Does your central air kick on? No. And the main reason is you're right within that correct range. You're within that range. You're not outside of it. It's pretty much at the set point you want. Let's say it starts getting warmer in your house. What happens is your thermostat then is going to compare the temperature that it actually is to the range you have on there. So let's say it compares the temperature and it's at 74 degrees and you have yours set between 68 and 72. You're now too hot. What happens? Well, if the house gets too hot, the central air is going to kick on. It's going to blow cold air into the house and it's going to bring that temperature back down, which then it gets compared to the set value again until it drops right back in the correct range. And then what happens? Your central air shuts off. And the opposite effect would happen if it got too cold. It gets too cold, gets down below that, your furnace kicks on, it's going to warm up the house until it gets back in that particular range. It then shuts off. This is an example of something that's not within our body trying to maintain homeostasis. But in this example, you can see we have a certain number of things. We had a variable that we were measuring. In this case, it was temperature. We had some type of implement that was doing the measuring. That was the thermostat. We had a control center that was kind of looking at what the temperature is, and then it was going to compare it to that set value, which is number 4 you can see there. So you have a standard value or area where you want the variable to be. So the control center looks at that, compares it to what the set point is. If it's within range, nothing happens. If it was too hot or too cold, what happened? Well, either the air conditioner or the furnace kicked on. And what really happens is this happens in the body hundreds of thousands of times every day. So, I mean, we can give you an example of blood pressure, for example. Blood pressure gets too high. If blood pressure gets too high, what do you need to be able to do? You need to be able to decrease it, right? So we're going to see on this one that the medulla oblongata is a control center. You have different receptors that can measure blood pressure. But again, if blood pressure goes too high, what do you have to do? You have to go in the opposite direction, right? So we get the response in the opposite direction of the stimulus. This is what we refer to as something called negative feedback. The movement of the variable is in the opposite direction of what triggered the response, so we call this negative feedback. So if we go back to blood pressure here, you can see, okay, you have increased blood pressure, as you can see right here. This is sensed by different receptors, and you don't need to know this for the first test here, but it's sensed by receptors in the aortic arch and in your carotid arteries. It's going to send that message up to the control center. The control center then, which is the medulla oblongata, is going to compare that to the set point and see if it's within range or not. In this case, it was too high. So it's going to send a message out to the effectors, which in this case is going to be the heart and the blood vessels, saying to the heart, slow down, don't contract as hard, which will lower blood pressure. It's also going to send a message to the blood vessel saying dilate, which is going to also lower blood pressure. If this dropped, this would get monitored again by this, and if it wasn't within range still, it would keep doing this. If it is within range, what's going to happen is it's going to sense it's within the set point, and it's going to stop that thing. So the other thing we see on this one is it is pretty much a self-terminating loop. So it's a negative feedback loop, opposite direction, and it stops on its own when it gets back within range. As you can see, this is going to be what we look at over and over again in different systems as how the body is maintaining homeostasis. We could talk about it with pH. We could talk about it with blood calcium levels. We could talk about blood sugar levels. That we could just a ton of different variables. I could go through example after example of a negative feedback loop. So you can see these are really highly involved in maintaining homeostasis. Why is it so common in the body? Again, every time it gets too high, it lowers it back down. Every time it gets too low, it brings it back up. And the other thing is it shuts itself off. That is why it's so common. And this really breaks it down into the simplest sense here. So you can see you have your initial stimulus. It brings about some type of response, and that stimulus goes in the opposite direction. It then feeds back up here, is monitored again. And if it's not within range, it keeps going. If it is, the loop is shut off. And again, just to keep hashing this over, almost every physiological process that we'll talk about in the body is using feedback loops like this to maintain homeostasis. The other thing is homeostasis is not necessarily always, it's not, if you look at your body temperature, if we were to take your temperature throughout the day, are you always going to be 98.6? And the answer to that is no. You can be in different ranges throughout that. So homeostasis, when we say it's dynamic, it's meaning there's a particular range in a lot of some. In some it's a really tight range, other ones it's a little bit wider range. But there is a range that is okay. And it can move around freely within that range without any effectors kicking on, without much of anything happening. It's only when it gets outside of that range that homeostasis and these feedback loops are going to kick in to bring it back within range. And because we had negative feedback, you're also probably going to ask, well, what about positive feedback? Because there's always going to be, it seems like, a yin and a yang in anything that we talk about. So positive feedback loop, if negative feedback went in the opposite direction, you can kind of get the idea that positive feedback is going to go in the same direction. So positive feedback is going to me, it's always kind of like a snowball rolling down a hill in the cartoons. You get that little ball going, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it runs into something, right? It's kind of the same thing here. It goes in the same direction. So what does this mean to us? Well, if we went back to that furnace example, if the temperature got hotter and positive feedback was how your furnace worked, it gets hotter. It amplifies that response. So in positive feedback, the furnace would kick on and make it hotter, which would cause another run around the loop, which would cause it to get hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. So you can, when you really start looking at, is that going to maintain homeostasis? And the real answer to that is not usually, but in certain circumstances, positive feedback is going to help maintain homeostasis. But it is the exception, not the rule. So probably one of the best examples of positive feedback in the body is going to be childbirth. So you get the stretch of the cervix. It causes a message to get sent up to the brain that causes oxytocin to be released, which causes uterine contraction, which pushes the baby harder against the cervix, which causes more oxytocin to be released, which causes more contraction. And you do this over and over again until that baby exits. At that point, something's been removed from the system, and when it goes to contract in on that again, there's nothing to stretch the cervix any longer, and it doesn't get the signal to release that oxytocin. Another example of this, and I don't know if I have a slide on it here, but is blood clotting, where you get the release of certain factors that cause platelets to stick, which release more factors that cause more platelets to stick, which help you to seal a broken blood vessel. Again, that's going to, in the long run, is going to maintain homeostasis. But if that happened not when there's a break in the blood vessel, it is not a good thing. So, like I said, positive feedback is used to help maintain homeostasis, but it is very much in specific circumstances. And this slide right here, just the last one to kind of nice and summarize it here. So you can see negative feedback, reverse. It's always frequently doing this, where positive feedback, it enhances the original stimulus, and it's really only for those conditions that do occur very often, and you're not trying to do a fine-tuning thing. It's so you have a break in the blood vessel, we need to seal it type of stuff.